The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi there, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this special webinar, part of our COVID-19 Thought Leader series. In these presentations over the next few weeks, we will be getting industry leaders in to share information to help you through this challenging period and support your clients. My name is Liam, and I'm part of the marketing team here at Netwealth, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Andrew Inwood, Principal and Founder of CoreData. Over the next 30 to 45 minutes, Andrew will be sharing CoreData's fresh, and I mean fresh, hot off the press research and insights into the impact the coronavirus crisis is having on Australians. Andrew will be delving into what impact it is having on investors, including advised clients, and what they are saying they want from their advisors right now. Before we get into the good stuff, let me just run through some housekeeping. There is a CPD allocation for attending this webinar. To receive the CPD point, you will need to have watched the majority of this webinar. The CPD details will then be emailed to you, hopefully within the next couple of weeks. Please be patient with us. There's just a bit longer turnaround time at present. This webinar is being recorded, and in that follow-up email, you will receive a copy of this session along with the slides. You do have an opportunity to ask Andrew some questions today. In the taskbar to your right, you'll see there's a question panel. Please type in anything you have, and at the end of Andrew's presentation, we will save some time to go through as many as we can. Just a little bit about us. We are an ASX listed company who provides an online platform to support financial advisors with a wide range of financial products and services to help you manage your clients' investments and superannuation. To partner with us, an award-winning platform to start running your business the way you want to. Some of the key features include a market-leading advisor and client portal, a mobile app to help you and your clients access key info on the go, a wide range of investment options such as managed accounts plus advanced transaction tools, a suite of detailed reports, and access to unique insights designed to help you grow your business. As mentioned, we have the pleasure of having Andrew Inwood, Principal and Founder of CoreData, join us today. Andrew has more than 30 years experience in the Australian financial services industry and is the author of more than 50 pieces of significant research into clients and their behaviour. He has a particular focus on the value of the client's experience in financial services, and that is what he is here to share today. So Andrew, I won't hold you back. Please take it away.
Thanks very much, Liam, and it's great to be here and talking to you guys. And I assume, like me, you're all in lockdown. This is a little bit boomy. I apologise, but that's the life of someone working from home. For those of you who don't know me, by background, I'm a behavioural economist, but I've worked for a very long time in financial services and like that, and think it's really important. For those of you who do know me, I hope that I don't repeat too many jokes, so that you not things that you've heard too much before. I want to focus today on four kind of core elements. The first is kind of understanding the history of disease and what's happening and what's going on. The second is how the country's feeling, and this is some research that we kicked off immediately we saw COVID coming through. We won't get to all of it today because the sample's not quite big enough for us to do the final piece of work that we want to do, which is look at the variation in experience between advised clients and unadvised clients. I'm going to say one thing though, that even in the relatively small sample, it's starting to be very clear the separation in experience between those two groups. Data that we should get to in the next month or so, which we as an industry should absolutely bank. Then I want to talk through the investment sentiment, and then what success looks like and what's going on. So I'm just toggling through this. It's going a little bit slow. So the first thing I want to talk about is kind of a history of disease. And the picture that you've got there in front of you is something which was drawn in the middle 1300s by the younger Bruegel. It talks about the Black Death. The Black Death, you probably know, turned up in April of, coincidentally, April of 1347 in the port of Messina in Italy on a boat which was coming from Africa. And like the current virus, it actually appears to have emerged from China. The Black Death, because we didn't have social distancing, among other things, killed about 30% of the world's population and had a very, very interesting effect on the world's economy. One of the things that it did, which is really curious, was that it changed the way in which the villages acted. Villages became separate economies rather than group economies. The other thing is it did, which was, I guess, the most interesting and significant historical event coming out of the virus, was it drove protein into the diet. Before the Black Death, there was about 160 people per cow, so not many people got much meat. After the Black Death, it was about 16 people per cow, and people started to get a lot more meat. And the countries which benefited most from that very quickly were the Dutch and the Germans, who got to be very big very quickly because they drove protein into the diet, which, as you know, changed the fundamental shape of the world for some hundreds of years to come. The point about this is this is not the first time that this has happened to us as a world, and it won't be the last time. How we deal with this and how we react to it is going to start to be very interesting. And we're seeing this separate around the world. You probably know that both Austria and Denmark are having limited reopenings of their economies from April the 14th because of the way in which they got on top of the virus expansion really quick, really early. And that's not going to happen in Italy, England, or America, which are fundamentally bigger economies for some time to come. So economic change is absolutely guaranteed, and economic uncertainty is absolutely guaranteed, just like it was at the time of the Black Death. One of the things that we have to talk about now, and we'll go through it, is the zeitgeist. And for those of you who speak German, you know that that means the spirit of the times. And the spirit of the times is really important to behavioral economists because it talks about how people are thinking and acting and feeling. And we know that sentiment is a much more powerful driver of spending than economic outcome. So understanding that becomes really, really important. We also know that the Germans specialized in portmanteau words, that's pushing two words together, as in zeitgeist, meaning spirit of the times, zeit meaning time, geist meaning ghost. We've also come up with a new one in West Germany, which is COVIDiot, which is someone who is too stupid to stay at home and deal with the social isolations. Particularly like the way that the Germans have handled this. Angela Merkel got up on stage and did a 12-minute speech to the country, was very clear about what she expected them to do. And after that, a man with a white lab coat with a pointer got up and said, this is where we're building the hospitals. This is how we're policing the situation. This is how you're going to feed yourself. Those of us in Germany know what have been through the compression of our freedoms in the past, so we know what this means, and we know why it's important. The measurable infection rate in Germany, West Germany, I think is about 0.81%, whereas right across the border in Italy, I think it's about 10%. I mean, I knew that the Italians weren't as organized as the Germans, but you can now kind of measure the organization effect. The Germans are 5 times as organized. And that's something which is worth noting depending on how you feel about the world. I'm going to take you through the COVID pulse research that we've been doing now. This is an online survey and we'll remain in field as long as required. I can see a spelling mistake there. I hope you don't see it. And then we'll have a look at what success looks like. But what's important to understand in this is that this is mass affluent or better modeling. We're not looking at people who are earning less than $80,000 a year because we're only really interested in the people who buy your services. Everyone else is not particularly interesting to this group. So a lot of the modeling that you might see at the moment is whole of population modeling. It's interesting, but not important to you. This I think is interesting and important. So the sample on this is the population for this sample, the cohort is 991 at the time we pulled this data, which was late last week. It's already past the 2000 mark now, and that data will be coming out next week. And there's some really interesting things to start to have a look at here. We have linear data on this because we model this quarterly, but we're now obviously doing it weekly. So the overall well-being number, which shows that 53% negative, is extraordinarily high. That number is normally oscillating around the 8 or 9% of the population. So it's 5 times worse than normal, and ditto mental health. Family relationship has only ticked up slightly, but if you start to frame the way in which people are thinking and feeling, whether they're expressing it or not, their tension in the marketplace is starting to grow and starting to grow significantly. It's going to be really interesting to see if this normalizes as people get used to the situation, which is a very common human behavior, or if it starts to get worse as the uncertainty creeps up. We have to think about that. That's going to start to separate inside your client group, and we're going to talk about that in the second half of this presentation. The second thing is you start to look at what's actually driving what's going on. People aren't feeling particularly isolated at the moment, so that's a good sign. Overwhelmed and confused and anxious and scared are the big numbers that are driving behavior. So if we start to think about your role in this relationship, overwhelmed and confused, for those people who are working with you, you've got to start to think that about a quarter of the people that you're talking to are being driven by confusion and fear. Depression, happy, isolated, those numbers are all still much the same as they have been for the last little while. So understanding the if that is important. The National Fear Tracker is really interesting. Obviously, people are worried about their health, but 83% of the population, of the mass affluent population in Australia, about 11 million consumers, are really worried about their personal finance and the impacts on the broader economy. That's a pretty rational fear. I'm sure you've read the media this morning. Partners inside the big 4 consulting groups, PwC, Deloitte, KPMG, etc., have all taken finance hits. Lawyers that I know have all taken finance hits. GPs that I know who form part of our high net worth and mass affluent investor database have all taken finance hits. It's really weird with social lockdown, people are seeing the GPs less frequently. And one of my friends who's in orthopedics has suffering a massive hit to his income because the rugby games have been cancelled and no people are skateboarding anymore, which is the driver of most of the injuries which come to see him. So fear is not just for people who are working in retail and hospitality, although it's very real there. It's across the network, which is quite significant. You start to have a look at the national household financial position. It's actually okay at the moment. If you look at the good and okay numbers, that's 66% of the people are good or okay at week 4 of the crisis. And about a third of the population are not great, bad, or dire. So as it stands, the numbers are okay. People aren't too stressed at the moment. But as the income picture gets choppier in the future, and people have to start to eat into their savings to perform, then we're expecting those numbers to change. And if you're interested, you can keep up to date with it on the CoreData homepage where we've got the tracker. But watching this and watching it behave is something which is going to be really interesting. When we start to understand what's actually driving people's fears in this space, and this is the percentage of the people who are actually worrying about it, about 40% of Australians think they're going to lose their job, and 60% think they're going to lose their income. 1 in 5 think they're going to have a real problem paying their bills. The loss of business and revenue is affecting 1 in 3, and the inability to pay for essentials is again 1 in 5. These are bad numbers. We've been tracking this quarter on quarter since the year 2004, and they're 5 or 6 times higher than they normally are. Normally we get about 10% of people think they're going to lose their income. It's now at 60%. So understanding that change frames the world in which we're operating. And while everything looks okay on the surface and people have got enough money for the next little while, you can see how this is going to be a problem as we move into the future. Cash flow cover remains relatively robust, though. You can see here that about 55% of Australians think they've got enough money to last 6 months, that they can go for 6 months without income of the mass affluent Australians. That naturally means that 45% don't. That about half the market don't have enough money to last the next 6 months and are going to have to get money from somewhere else. The cascading order of hierarchy on this falls to family. Normally families stand together and help each other. Where that doesn't exist, the government move into the system. You can't say too much about what the government's doing at the moment and the way in which they're operating. The kind of government spend on this at the moment, plus the cost to the income, is as close as we can figure about $130 billion a quarter. That money has to come from somewhere. There's nowhere for that money to come from. At the moment, the government is printing bonds and selling them to the Reserve Bank. They've put their hand up for 26 billion of those at the moment. We actually have a relatively low government debt ratio compared to the rest of the Western world, but that can't go on forever. One of the things that might bob up in the future is some new form of taxation. If you were to look at the taxation structure in Australia and say, what's the area which has been least affected by taxation rebuild? Personal tax in Australia is relatively high. The top 2% of the population actually fund 26% of the tax receipts. Company tax on a global stance is relatively high. Australia taxes very, very strictly. The space where there is room to wiggle is probably in the GST area. Now, GST is 10% on goods and services. You would know that it's 15% in New Zealand, 20% in the UK, and about between 15 and 20% in most of Western Europe and the USA. So if I was a gambling man, I would suggest that GST review is probably underway and on the table. I'm not a particular fan of it. It's a regressive tax. And as you know from Year 10 economics, regressive taxes affect the poor more than they affect the rich, but there might have to be another way of coping with that. But it's something which is probably on the cards and we have to think about. So employer concerns spike. So 1 in 3 is worried about losing their current job, and of those who are worried about losing their current job, 74% think that finding employment will be relatively impossible. Whether it's impossible or not, there is a couple of things which are likely to happen. There will be fundamental shifts in the economy, and one of those will probably be wage repricing. After 27 years without a recession, wage growth in Australia has been relatively strong, and wage growth, as you know, again from Year 10 economics, is a sticky growth. It's hard to make it go down. This is probably going to reset sort of income growth. Like a lot of people on the phone call, I employ people all over the world. It's 146 people working for CoreData, and we are by far the most expensive country in the world to employ people in the roles that we employ them. So understanding that is important. Whether or not there's going to be hard asset repricing, we don't know. There are some cases for deflation, particularly in property classes, and watching that's going to be really important. Of course, it's hard to tell at the moment because supply has evaporated, and once supply comes back onto the market, we'll be able to see that a little more clearly. Investor sentiment has really plummeted. 56% of the people that we have spoken to say they've been negatively impacted. I think that's about right. Only a third of people feel financially secure. I think that's probably about right. And only 23% are happy with their current investments. Negatively impact is a new thing for us to be tracking because obviously we didn't have the COVID virus before. But financial security and happy with investments are things that we've been tracking for a while. And those numbers have changed quite significantly. I'll get to that in the second part of the presentation. You can see here on slide 21, this is what's been happening with overall investor sentiment. We were bobbling along at kind of mildly negative post the bushfires and the drought. Australia had moved into mildly negative territory. It's now gone into massively negative territory. I took some time to look at the new data coming through before I got onto this call. It's showing you -45 here. It's gone even further down. We're down in the -60s now. So people have got a very, very negative investor sentiment. And you know how people behave with negative investment sentiment. Not all people, but most people behave with negative investment sentiment. They tend to run to cash, and they tend to run to secure asset classes, and they tend to pull money out of the economy. That's why the government has to put money in. If we see this like a balancing ratio, as the money comes out of the private sector, the money's got to come in from the public sector to keep this going. It's worth talking about how the countries around the world have reacted to this. I don't want to get too hung up on the Western Europeans, but they've started to act very swiftly and come out and talk about this in a very aggressive way, as have the Americans. The Germans and the Americans both have said that they have unlimited firepower to deal with this, and they're abandoning any idea of a balanced budget as they start to deal with it. We haven't been quite as aggressive. No, our Treasurer is not the type of person who gets on the front page of the Financial Times and says, we have a bazooka of spending to unleash, which is what the Germans did, but we still have to find a way to overcome this. And that's going to be problematic and time consuming. If you look at asset class sentiment here, which is slide 22, you can see what you would expect to happen in this space. Have a look at property in this one, which is direct property, which is the red line. It was tracking as the kind of most mildly positive of all the asset classes that we hold in Australia, and it's absolutely come off the boil. I've done a survey of the people who own rental properties amongst our group in CoreData, and all of them have had to make adjustments of how they are charging for rent, or expecting to make adjustments for how they're charging to rent. They're expecting their yields to change. Interesting, right? For those of the people who do hold cash and do have some other investments, there are a number of people, a corresponding number of people who are waiting for property to reprice and to re-enter the market, which I think is probably to be considered. And you've seen gold go up as people have really, run security, and international equities go down. For those of you who take the kind of Warren Buffett view of the world, to quote something that he stole from a man called Nathan Rothschild, is that to be greedy when other people are fearful is a sure sign of success. Of course, we've been out talking to financial advisors. Some of you who I've been talking to who are on the phone because you've been sending me texts saying get on with it, and amongst other things. You're seeing the reverse action of people actually getting in there and starting to actually buy. Personally, that's something I've been doing, but you have to take a sort of different view of the world to actually do that. So investing intention is mixed, about 10 to 12%, and I think that market's kind of number is starting to creep up now. Are starting to purchase new investment products because they're seeing buying opportunities return, and there's already been some of the kind of massive swings in the market which have allowed us to exploit that. 1 in 5-ish is going to invest more money directly into equities, and 18% are going to invest more money in new investments. So people buying the dip, it looks like about 20% of the people are actually interested in buying the dip in the next 90 days. That, if you start to do behavioural segmentation, is about right. Those are the people who are able to plan for the future, see misvaluations, and actually make decisions based on future behaviours rather than immediate behaviours. It's not a commonly distributed behaviour across humans. It's actually relatively uncommon, as I said, 1 in 5, but they're the ones who are going to act. The interesting part about that group is that they're most likely to have a financial advisor relationship. So this is a interesting conversation that you need to have with people who are sitting inside your cohort and the way in which they're acting. Here's the kicker though, right? 75% or 3/4 of Australians think that Australia is going to enter recession within the next 3 months, and it's absolutely almost certain within the next 12 months. Arguably, depending on which economists you follow, we're in recession, and we've probably been in recession since December, depending on who you believe. Our interest rates are at net zero. They're at 25 basis points. If you follow world interest rates like me, you'll know that Sweden's come off negative interest rates. I think it was 3 weeks ago, because the governments have worked out that negative interest rates don't actually work, and there is kind of no change in human behaviour between a negative rate and a mildly positive rate, which ours is, which is 25 basis points. Here's the thing though, if you're an Australian bank and you can borrow money from the government at 25 basis points, or an Australian business that can borrow money from the Australian government at 25 basis points, your spread on lending and providing buffers to people is significant. And the ability for the Australian banks to provide buffers to the marketplace at the moment is pretty powerful, because they can buy money very, very cheaply. So understanding that is really important. One of the considerations that you might take, and I don't know where this fits in your business or is something that's interesting to your business, but debt management at a time like this becomes really important. If you can start to become a great debt manager at a time when money is cheap and start to have good conversations with your network about that, then that's something which is going to be absolutely well received. And the recent data we've put together on people seeking debt management from advisors suggests that this is an unmet need in the marketplace. This crisis has been good for ScoMo. ScoMo, you can have whatever opinion you have about him, mildly negative, mildly positive, or swinging either way. He's been running mildly negative numbers across the Australian voter base at every point until they've actually had to decide between him and Bill Shorten or Anthony Albanese. What's really interesting is that the latest news poll, it's kind of a wildly inaccurate poll, but it is the latest news poll, has suggested that he's now and the government's now in positive territory for the first time really ever. Not in living memory, but for certainly the last decade. And you can see here what's actually driving that. 54% of people think he's actually doing 56% of people think he's actually doing a good or very good job. And this again is the mass affluent, not the people who are at the bottom end or the very top end of the scale. So you can see why he's getting the ScoMo blow. I want to move from there to dealing with the crisis, the things that can happen right now. For those of you who have heard me before or have read the stuff that I've written, you know that this is the part of the world which I like to focus on the most, and I think where financial planners can make the most difference. It's pretty easy for us to prove in the research we've done how financial advice makes a difference. It's pretty easy for us to produce an evidence trail about this. And in a crisis, it's going to make a very big difference to the people that you're dealing with. And understanding how people decide and how they act in this space is absolutely important. The first thing that you have to do when you're understanding this is kind of choose your guru. And the people on the page in front of you, the person on your left is someone if you're interested in behavioral economics, everyone knows well. He got the second Nobel Prize in behavioral economics. It's a guy called Richard Thaler, who won it with a man called Cass Sunstein for modeling behavior. And the man on your right is not a behavioral economist, although he was or a psychologist, but he is possibly the greatest leader of people through a crisis that has been evidenced that ever existed. It's a man called Ernest Shackleton, and I'll talk about both these guys as I go through this. Unfortunately, this slide has lost an E as it's been transponded, but I want to quickly talk about trust. Trust is a very well understood psychological phenomenon. People have been doing research on it since the kind of middle 1800s. And the person who first started doing this was Ivan Pavlov, and then it's gone from there. And I won't bore you with hundreds of examples of trust researchers, although trust me, given a couple of whiskeys and time, I would do that. And it would be a terrible experience for you and a very enjoyable one for me, but I'm going to avoid it now. So there's four big constructs of trust. They're benevolence, competence, authenticity, and predictability. Benevolence doesn't mean giving. It actually means, is this person acting in my best interest? Are they aligned with my best outcomes? This is a kind of ordered hierarchy of trust drivers. So is this person acting in my best interests? Are they good at what they say they do? Authenticity is, are they who they say they are? And how predictable are they given a crisis? Predictability, which is usually a very small driver of trust, as in a crisis like this, drives up the value chain. How predictable are you being at the moment when you're communicating with people? Have you set up a regular communication? Have you increased frequency? Are you doing it on the same day? Is the message much the same? Are you sticking to the same script? Authenticity is something you build over time. It's a really simple thing to measure and a very powerful driver of human activity. It's, are you who you say you are, and do you do what you say you're going to do? It's one of the most powerful kind of hardwired parts of human behavior that exists. Competence is about your technical ability, and benevolence is about how you align with them. So you've got to understand those drivers, and you can measure those drivers. So we've done that with people who've got a financial advisor, and we've asked those questions in slightly different ways. You don't ever ask those questions directly because people give what they call behaviorally correct or behaviorally applicable answers. So you have to ask them in a kind of complex way. So here's the data on financial advisors on Australia. Any number over 60% in this is a very powerful number. Any number between 6 and 8 is very powerful. So financial advisors in Australia, if this is for people who have financial advisors, and this sample is about 1,600 people, in the main, share all of the goals of their customers. They do what they say they're going to do 70% of the time. They're competent 70% of the time. they're reliable, and they act in their best interests. This is a great outcome for the industry, and it's something that we ought to promote. The people who are working with financial advisor, most of the time, have a very, very positive outcome in their experience, and it's got to be something that you should be tracking with your customers, and understanding with your customers, and something that you can talk about to new customers. This is how people feel about me. Remember the hats of utility. Remember if you've seen this presentation in the past, the things that you actually do for people as a financial advisor. And this is how they stack in order in the main. You've got to be a great strategist. You've got to guide clients through this process. And it's really important for people who are trying to outsource the decision making. You've got to be a great tactical advisor. That means making small changes and getting things done. You've got to be a great implementer, people who actually take control of the actions and go through these things. And you've also got to be able to be a partner, to be able to take peace of mind and reduce tension and uncertainty. You're probably doing all of these things unconsciously, and you probably have a dominant characteristic unconsciously. It's incredibly important to understand that. But once you start to understand that this is the things that people buy from you, strategy, tactics, implementation, and partnership, then you need to be able to understand how to unpack that and which of those to accelerate at any given time, given what the market's doing and the way in which it's going. I want you to understand the world of Richard Thaler, and if you haven't read Nudge or listened to it, I encourage you to do it. There's some really good summaries on the internet of it. One of the most important things to understand is that people are hedonistic, which means that they seek pleasure. Pleasure means different things to different people, and we need to unpack that a little bit later on. People are very bad, 80% of people are very bad at the future, planning for the future. They can do it kind of or sort of, but they make it really hard to do. One of the things that you do, and one of the most important things that you do as a financial advisor, is bring the future to life and actually make it real and make the big decisions for them. But the other thing that you have to understand that you do, whether you want to admit it or not, is that you are a choice architect. You help to rank choices in people's minds and help them to make good decisions. Year after year after year, with the mystery shopping, the advisor network that we use, the advised customer database that we have, when we go through the data, the things that people have done them, it's really clear to me that the best thing that happens in a relationship with a financial planner is that it stops people making bad decisions. You'll have much more data about that than me, and you'll have a lot of data about the people who make bad decisions and what happens and how that affects them. The next thing that I wanted you to think about is that you can't really force people to make good decisions. You have to leave what's called a clue train or a nudge portfolio to help people make good decisions when you're not there. Again, I encourage you to read the book Nudge, but think about every communication that you have now as nudging people to feeling confident about the decisions, making the right decisions for them, and making less stupid decisions. I can't talk about it in too much detail, but we have great relationships with the Australian superannuation community. And one of the things that we talk to the Big Four pretty persistently, and we talk to the investment committees, the customer committees, et cetera, et cetera. Hundreds of thousands of Australians in the last 3 or 4 weeks have moved large amounts of money from an equity portfolio to a cash portfolio in what they think is a defensive move to preserve the value of their assets. What they've done in reality is crystallize the loss. This is an unbelievably poor decision which they may never recover from in their investing lifetime, depending on how close they are to retirement and how quickly they get the money back into the system. We know that from one of them, they can separate the cohort between advised clients and unadvised clients. Advised clients, very few people have been making the change. The vast majority of people who have been making the change have been unadvised clients, and it is a fundamentally poor decision unless you think the world's going to end and you're going to spend all that money now. One of the things that we need to do, and when we do this, is kind of unpack how people react to a crisis and understand that not everyone reacts the same way to a crisis. Because I'm interested in the market and I'm engaged in the market, and I work with my family as a group on this, we see this as a kind of massive buying opportunity. And it says more about us than anything else. And I don't want to talk too much about myself, but I use it as an example. The person who first started writing about this, about the different types of people, it came out in the early 1950s, was this guy, Carl Jung. And he first started to look at the big four drivers of people, which is the shadow, the animus, the persona, and the self. I'm not going to talk about the shadow, the animus, and the self. They're kind of interesting and they take a lot more time and detail to get into. But and they're certainly worth reading about. If you ever get a chance to read Man and His Shadows, it's really worth it. But let's talk about the persona now. The personas, the kind of Jungian, post-Jungian persona drivers that we all understand are controller, warrior, externalizer / coach seeker, and avoider. Let's think about this really hard. The people that sit in the advice world are the controllers, the warriors, and the externalizers and the coach seekers. The avoiders, they end up not doing anything because they don't want to bear the pain of making a decision. Controllers are the group who are very data-driven and really focused a bit more on the future than everybody else. So they're the 1 in 5 that I'm talking about that are getting into the market and actually doing something and making big decisions around that. They tend to be rich because they tend to study more. They tend to be rich because they tend to see money as a score of achievement. And they tend to be rich because they have advice relationships. Warriors and externalizers are the people who seek you as a partner in this relationship. They want to give the job to you. They're very good clients. They're very good clients because they build trust with you quite quickly, and they tend to actually to be less interfering and less worried about what's going on in the future because they're past that risk to you. So when you're looking at your client base and how you communicate to them, you've got to start to think about who's the controller, who's the person who's ringing me up and saying, what can I buy? What are the opportunities? What are the things that you think we should be doing now? And what are the people who are ringing up you and saying to you, is everything okay? Is everything okay? Is there anything I should be worried about, or should I be doing something? And the data that we've got suggests that those are both the calls that you guys are getting at the moment. So let's reorder the hats. This is the order of hats that people are asking you to wear now. And the first one for all of the groups is the partner hat. This is the really interesting point, right? Under stress, people really want to see the benevolence coming through. They want you to be acting as their partner. And secondly, they want you to be able to help them make the short-term decisions, which is the tactical advisor. What do I do now? Now, the right answer for a lot of these people is do nothing, but they need to actively do nothing, if that makes sense. They need to be able to do something which allows them. So this is the 3-month goal, right? So tactically, we're not rushing to do anything. And then they want the strategist goal to appear, which is things are going to change. The economy is going to change. What's our strategy in the changing economy? And you're starting to form your view of that already, I'm sure. You're starting to see, well, what does this mean to retail groups? What does it mean to travel groups? What does it mean to international economies? There are far better economists than me who will be talking about that, and it's certainly worth listening to. And then implementation is going to come further on down the line. So if you start to stack that, this is really important. Partnership is the most critical thing. People need to know that you're in this with them and that you are acting as their partner. Then they need to know that you've got a short-term goal, then a long-term goal, and then that you're going to be able to implement that for them. So guru number 2 is this guy, right? It's Ernest Shackleton. He was a polar explorer. He got unlucky. He sailed into the worst winter that had ever happened in the Antarctic and got trapped. He was an incredible communicator. And what's interesting about Shackleton is that he took about 60 men with him while they got trapped on the sea ice, and he had to sail to the bottom of Argentina, and he left a whole bunch of people on a giant ice floe. He got everybody home. And he did this through completely unconsciously exploiting a whole bunch of great command principles which come through Jung. First one is that he became micro-ambitious. He set a series of daily tasks for the crew to be doing to actually manage themselves and manage them through the processes and the way in which they do things. And this becomes really important. So setting micro ambitions or daily tasks or daily activities, particularly of people who are stuck at home, people who can't communicate, this is something that allows them to intellectually take control of what is an uncontrollable environment. Then he was really good at over communicating. Really making sure that the crew knew every day what was going on. He had a morning briefing, a lunchtime briefing, and an evening briefing. That's now being referred to as team scrum, but he had persistent briefings talking about what was going in. And then he honed in on the detail. So he started to talk about in very clear detail about what had to happen all the time, and then kept the path of activity clear. He didn't keep changing the path. He didn't keep changing the plan. He worked with his team, he established the plan, and he kept communicating that plan and kept the team focused on the long plan, not on the short term. Don't overreact, don't overdo it. Here are the jobs we've got to do today. So everyone understand the jobs we've got to do today. This is why we're doing the jobs we're going to do today. This is the plan to get everybody home, and keeping everyone focused on that became really interesting and important. He got everybody out safely. Why it's important to start to follow those plans about over-communicating, making the long-term clear, letting people understand that you're in this for the long haul is really important. The great quote that comes from this from a British geologist about this, which I kind of love, because whatever you say about Shackleton, he was an incredible manager of men, but quite a poor explorer. For scientific discovery, give me Scott. For speed and efficiency of travel, give me Adamson. But when disaster strikes and all hope is gone, get down on your knees and pray for Shackleton. He followed the rules really tightly. He focused on partnership. He focused on micro goals. He focused on medium-term goals, and he got everybody out of this. You're going to have two groups of people inside your network. A small group who tend to be controllers, which means that they want to use data to make decisions, who are going to try and make the best of this situation to improve their lot, and a very large group who are just looking for you to be a partner at the moment. And that's me. Thank you for taking the time to listen, and I'll hand back to Liam.
Thank you, Andrew. Really good presentation there. I think the first half really helped to sink in the impact this whole virus is having and how it's potentially changing the landscape for a long, long time. And then, yeah, excellent way to finish there. We'll move on to some questions. If you guys have any questions, it's not too late to submit them. Just type them in, and we'll endeavour to get through as many as we can using the question panel on your taskbar to the right. We got a comment here from Graham. Andrew, you may know him. He's just saying he'd love to spend a couple of hours with you talking about trust, as long as you're the one shouting the whiskey.
Anytime, Graham.
It was really good hearing what you said about being advisors wanting to be a partner. I was speaking to an advisor the other day, actually, who said he was spent all last week making sure he either phoned or personally emailed each and every one of his clients to let them know that they haven't been forgotten about during this time, and he is working with them to help them get through it. Is there anything like that you're seeing in the market which you sort of would maybe recommend or suggest to people listening today to do?
So I've seen two things which I really like. There's one group, one guy I know very well who's doing a kind of a daily briefing note, which is going out really well, and that's getting a lot of traction, a lot of affection from our customer panel. The people who are receiving it really like it, and they get a lot out of it, which is really interesting to me. And the other thing that we're seeing, which is working really well, is the people bringing together groups of people who are interested in taking a kind of more active approach to this. I spoke last Monday at one particular advisor who got together a kind of investment club of his customers who wanted to be buyers in this network, and arranged for them to have an economist from Deutsche Bank. He's an English guy, but he's a Deutsche Bank economist, to speak about what they saw as the opportunities emerging around the world, and he got a lot of activity out of that. That was weirdly, vigorously circulated amongst their people's friends. There was a lot of hunger for that kind of data, what's happening in the US, the UK, and other places.
Excellent. Yeah, really good stuff that's gone on there. We've got a few people just asking if they'll get a copy of the recording and slides. Yes, we will be emailing those to you within the next week. We got a question here. For a long time, sort of Australian property has been seen as almost a bulletproof investment. Now that it's just looking at your chart, the sentiment's gone right down. How are most Australians coping with that? Do you think they're in a good position, or what? Have you got any comments around that?
Well, the only comments I have come from the data. Obviously, the cohort is mass affluent Australians. I think that everyone's okay at the moment. Well, not everyone. Sort of 80% of people are okay at the moment. But the likelihood for those numbers to change kind of increases every day that the lockdown goes on and the economic uncertainty starts to rise and rise and rise. There's two things which are worth noting about this. The Australian economy is driven by three big events: our ability to export minerals, which of course is going down, although the government is doing everything it can to keep that plastic. our ability to manufacture foodstuffs, which is going just fine, and our ability to sell education to the rest of the world, which isn't going just fine. So the numbers coming out of the economy at the moment are pretty significant, and how they recover is going to be very interesting. Older Australians who tend to be consumers of advice are probably a misrepresentative group. They're the group who are taking control of their future, and they're probably in pretty good shape. It's the people who aren't taking control of the future which are going to be in a really interesting shape. So if we take one cohort, there's a guy he's a psychiatrist by training, and he has only invested in rental property, in particular commercial rental property, for the past, as long as he's been on that panel, I guess about 12 years. And he rang last week in tears because everyone's contacted him and said, I can't pay my rent because it's all these strip shops around Sydney and Melbourne. And so there's no point in talking to him about how much he's ridden out of that or how much yield he's got in the future or how he has to reprice yield. All he can see is the strategy that he's built for his family evaporate in front of his eyes. So individually, that's going to be problematic. And whatever you said to this guy in the past about diversification has fallen on deaf ears because he's saying, I'm getting 9%, I'm getting 10%. I'm very happy with the way it's going. So that's quite interesting. So the cohort is split and split into two groups of people who understand what's going on and can deal with it, and a group who can't understand what's going on and can't deal with it. But the groups that I worry about the most, and I'm sure everyone else feels the same way, is people who've had their kind of businesses stripped from them, and they've been great businesses in the past. A family that own a vast number of hotels in the eastern seaboard of Australia. Of course, every one of those is now shut down, so they have no revenue on any of those hotels, and that's going to be a challenge. And the same is true all around the world.
Yeah, totally agree. Got an interesting question here. With this crisis happening and the younger generation, seeing boomers and older people, obviously it looks like it's just been good days for them, but now this is the younger generation sort of first experience through a crisis. Do you think that potentially opens them up to be advised clients? They may want to see the value in an advisor moving forward.
Yeah, look, I'm working really hard on this with one particular licensee at the moment to understand and be able to bank the data about how having an advisor makes a difference in this. I mean, selfishly, this is going to provide unbelievable data points about how much an advisor adds in terms of real value, and not just confidence value, which is an important part, but actually economic value. And to be able to display that is going to be critical, I think, for the industry. Will it open up the boomers to it? Look, that's a pretty interesting question, right? If you're in Australia and you've been through this 27 years of uninterrupted growth, and we can talk about why that's happened and how that's happened at another time. The reality is that they are going to have to start to question their ability to be bulletproof and whether they can actually take responsibility for their future. I don't want to go too much into this because you haven't really asked the question, but there's a lot of people who've established ways of thinking which are based on the fact that the economy goes up forever and goes up without scant effort, that they don't actually compete for their future in that kind of Gary Hamel way. I think that is going to be taken away because people in Australia and maybe in Western Europe and America are going to face economic uncertainty for the first time. Again, it's a pejorative thing to say, but I mean, one of the most deafening silences of the communities out there is from the anti-vaxxer community. They're pretty silent at the moment because turns out that resilience and planning and actually building proper portfolios and having a plan for the future turns out to be really, really important. You can't just do this yourself. You're going to need some expert advice.
Yeah, and this is just one vaccine we don't have. Another question has come through, and this is maybe based on a presentation we did a couple of months ago with Jason, is you guys have split the advisor businesses into 4 segments. I think they call the Ox, Fox, Island, and there's another one. Where do you see them? How do you see their future through this? And is this perhaps accelerating some of
Yeah,
the
this
demise of
is
a couple?
the really interesting question on this is that the future of these guys isn't constrained by the market. It's really constrained by the way in which the regulation is shifting. The regulators and the regulators have made a series of decisions about the kind of perfect business that they want to be in the world. And one of the ways in which they see that evincing itself is through the payment methods. The regulator, and I don't want to speak too much for them, but they're driven by the best of intentions. And the best of intentions is, and they've made this really clear, they know now that advice is valuable and that done properly, it's really valuable. How that's paid for and how that's delivered is now something which is really important to them, and who it's delivered by. If you look at the Foxes and Oxes, and when we talk about those businesses, they're the ones that've got really clear business plans. They're the ones who, for want of a better phrase, aren't in financial services or aren't accidental business owners. They're running their financial businesses with a great deal of planning, a great deal of forethought, and a great way of understanding it. They understand the systems, they understand the processes, and they're working hard on building those into their businesses. My sense is that those businesses are going to be just fine. In fact, every bit of data I have at the moment is that those businesses at the moment are incredibly busy, because people who've been thinking about getting advice for a long time are now saying, you know what, I actually need to pull the trigger on this and I need to see these people. And I speak to them pretty regularly. Some of them are on this call because they're texting me, and they're busy. They're getting lots of work. The people who are working by themselves and have got a single plan are maybe finding life a little bit more problematic, because the world in which they work in is changing, and the way in which they get revenue is changing. And the people who are essentially part-timers in this business and have come to this after perhaps being in another business or working on kind of older commission structures, they're having to adjust their businesses. And I'm seeing 2 things happen here, and this is amongst the cruisers. There's a group who are adjusting very quickly and making good decisions, and when I meet with them, I really get it. I don't necessarily get the way in which they expect to earn revenue by moving into the asset management chain or into the platform chain. I think that's complex and problematic and hard to do well, and I haven't ever really seen it work. But I get it when they are working on establishing better relationships with clients, better systems and processes inside their businesses, and better onboarding structures. And there's a group in the main who are finding the new education standards too hard, so who are kind of slowly exiting their businesses. They tend to be older, and that makes sense as well, right? Either sell it or close it down or do something. But they are all behaving differently. The Oxes are going to face a little bit of a problem. One of the challenges, in the Ox businesses is that, unlike the Foxes, they tend to have 2 types of partners, older partners and younger partners. If they're not making the adjustments now, their older partners are going to find it harder to drive value out of the business. And of course, they want to drive value out of the business. They're closer to the retirement. The younger partners are going to find it relatively easy to drive value into the business, which is a kind of natural tension which exists inside those businesses. So they might have to start to maybe change their retirement plans. Maybe this adds a year or 2 years to the retirement plans and the peak valuation of the business, but it doesn't make it disappear. It just puts it on hold maybe for a couple of years.
Yeah, thanks for that. We'll just finish off with 2 more questions. We have had quite a few come through, so apologies if we didn't get to yours in this time. Do you have any sort of comparative data or analysis of sentiments and everything that's going on compared to the GFC?
We do, and we're working on that as we speak. So we're looking at a piece of comparative data that, compared to the GFC. The thing that's taking a bit of time is we've got the same data for the US and the UK businesses, so I'm putting that together. It's much worse than the GFC, much more sudden and much worse.
That's interesting. We'll keep an eye out for that one. And another question here, which is quite interesting as well. Given all the uncertainty and volatility, and it just seems like it's pretty negative, the world at the moment. If you're an advisor, should you be trying to remain and communicate positively with your clients, or do you think that might be seen as unrealistic, annoying, and perhaps lose a bit of trust and
So
credibility there?
this is a really interesting question, and I don't want to get too Jungian on this, but you've got to meet the customers where they are. So by meeting the customers where they are, being positive isn't necessarily the thing that you need to do, but being really factual is the really important thing to do. Talk about the volatility, talk about the history of these things, talk about how long this is going to take. Say that the revaluation is probably, the GFC was a 3 to 5 year revaluation. This is probably going to be a shorter one because it's not an economic driver, it's a behavioural driver, but that's how long it's going to take, and make it clear that this isn't your first crisis. So emotion isn't important. What's really important is clarity and confidence and channeling Shackleton, right? They're trapped on the ice. Everyone's bloody afraid. Don't pretend that you've got a magic bullet to this or that there's some instant solution, but really be really clear about that you know what you're doing. It's not the first time you've seen this, and there's a pattern of behaviours that in these crises is really successful, and you know what they are.
Awesome. We'll wrap it up. Yeah, sorry, Andrew, continue.
Well, I mean, I don't want to go too much in the sailing analogies, but when you first enter a storm, every minute feels like an hour. By the time you've been in the storm 20 hours, you kind of normalize to it. This is going to take some time for people to get normalized to it, but it'll come. And you being steady at this time is going to be really important.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Andrew. We'll wrap it up there. Just before we go, you said CoreData have a bit of an insight hub going on that listeners can check out.
Yeah, so if you look at CoreData homepage, coredata.com.au, or the new model advisor, which is where we communicate to advisors, we've got a full set of data which is appearing there under the COVID-19 pulse. Check on that. It's going to be updated weekly, and you can see these numbers coming through weekly. So soon this is going to be longitudinal data, so you can see what the movements are. I think this is really important to check on, because the moment that sentiment starts to change and people start to swing to the positive, that's when you're probably going to get a lot more calls and a lot more activity, and start to be prepared for that.
All right, well, Andrew, thank you so much for joining and presenting today. Listeners, I hope you found that really enjoyable and valuable. I'll just finish off with a couple of housekeeping points. Yeah, will be CPD accredited, and we have recorded this webinar. We'll package both the CPD point and the webinar recording into an email that you will be sent with. CPD point turnarounds is taking a bit longer than usual at the moment, so we hope to have it with you in the next week, but please bear with us if it takes a little bit longer. We do appreciate your patience. Our next webinar in this COVID-19 Thought Leaders series will be with Michael Ellsworth. He's the Executive Director of Lonsec, and he will be sharing his latest research on retirement income strategies during volatile and uncertain markets. While you're at home and stuck up on the couch, you might enjoy some fascinating listening. So check out our Between Meetings podcast series. Our joint managing director, Matt Heiner, speaks to industry professionals to uncover opportunities and challenges for financial advisors. We actually just recently released our latest episode with Grant Hackett. He's former gold medalist Olympian and CEO of Generation Life, about what his ingredients for success are. Really good and interesting podcast there. And we've also got our portfolio construction podcast, where we are speaking to wealth management experts about strategies that should be considered during these unprecedented times. Not on here, and as well that you should check out is Banker. That's our financial literacy partner. We have just, in collaboration with Banker, they just launched a whole new online channel that's free to access, that gives you sort of online tools and tasks and activities to teach your kids about financial literacy and valuable life skills while school is out. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We hope to see you next time. And Andrew, thank you once again. See ya. Bye.
Bye now.